Your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Friday weekend edition. We're so grateful that you could join us today. A little bit later, we'll open up the phones if you'd like to join the conversation. 1-800-351-1212. Of course, we'll probably say something about Elon Musk, Donald Trump, but there's just a lot of other things to cover, including some very important Supreme Court decisions, as well as, of course, the Trump travel ban, which we want to get into, the whole question of President Biden, the auto pen, even his annual physical. Dr. Matthews has written about this, tariffs, and a variety of other issues. So there's a lot to cover, much of which affects you on your day-to-day life. And, of course, there is the spat between the two individuals that we will cover a little bit. In studio with me today is Erin Smith. She's Associate Counselor for First Liberty Institute. It's great to have you back.
Yeah, thank you. Glad to be back.
Dr. Merrill Matthews, of course, with the Institute for Policy Innovation. And Dr. Matthews, we've posted at least two of your articles, which we'll get into today. But we've seen this before, where two rather prominent individuals with rather large egos don't necessarily always get along.
They do not always get along. And it was interesting because I sort of thought in the back of my mind, this is never going to work long term, just because you have two huge egos who have somewhat different ways of doing things. And my goodness, that has turned into a spat. And I have to say, from Elon Musk's point of this new bill coming up, the big, beautiful bill spends too much, I have to agree with that. I don't disagree with that at all. But it's interesting how personal the spat has gotten.
Yes. Even
to the point of Musk suggesting that the Department of Justice has a file on Trump and Jeffrey Epstein, who were friends at some point until about 2005, if I remember right. There was an accusation that Epstein had abused one of Trump's friends or something, a female, and he said, "I'm not having anything more to do with you," and I don't think there's been anything since then, as far as I know. But it's been interesting how antagonistic this has gotten, and there was notions today, mentions that they were going to try to set up a call to try to have them work things out, because not only does Trump have to deal with Xi and Putin, he now has to deal with Musk.
I know. Well, and again, we could talk about that for the entire 2 hours, but a lot of talk shows have. But I just think there's some very important things. And Erin, that's why I brought you in, because we always like to talk about some of these religious liberty cases. This particular one is our first article. It was one which I believe First Liberty filed a friend of court brief, right? Just an amicus brief. But it's an important one because, as I pointed out, the Supreme Court protects church outreach ministries. This one has to do with Catholic Charities, but you're dealing with other individuals that have had criminal prosecution because they've been working with the homeless, prosecutions because they're handing out food. So in some respects, that's become a new issue that you at First Liberty have had to address, isn't it?
Right. Recently, we got to see, these government entities and cities going after these churches and ministries that were just caring for the needy, just like they believe the Bible tells them to do, and the government standing in their way and saying, "No, sorry, you can't do this. We don't want you serving people that need food or need shelter." So this was a great case by the Supreme Court, unanimous opinion, written by Justice Sotomayor, which was a surprise, I think, to everyone that she was the author of this opinion. I'm just saying, sorry, Wisconsin, you got this one wrong. You can't say that Catholic Charities, what they're doing is not, sufficiently religious, just because they're not doing something that the court was saying, well, it's not technically a religious activity to care for the needy. Well, that doesn't make any sense. That's just the silliest notion, I think, that I've heard in a while. So,
Dr. Matthews, we've talked about this before, that if you're doing something as a religious organization and there's something else that's unrelated business income, then that is taxed. So I don't want people to think that Catholic Charities or any other Christian group can do everything they want. but it really started a strained credulity to say Catholic Charities, which is doing what Catholic Charities have been doing for decades,
2,000 years.
Even there, and for 2 centuries in this country, then all of a sudden you're not Catholic because you're doing the things that Catholic Charities always has done.
You know, it's interesting too, because there have been cases that where groups have claimed a religious exemption. If I remember right, there was the group, the Church of Bacchus.
Yeah.
and they wanted to be able to write off all the wine they bought because they said they were a church. And then I think the courts had to say no,
don't think
you're
so.
not. You're not along. So there is some precedent for groups claiming to have a religious exemption based upon something that is either they just came up with in order to enjoy something. But as you point out, this is what Catholic Charities do, and they've been doing it for 2,000 years in terms of being able to reach out and help people and minister to various people and provide help and to the poor, immigrants, and everything else. And that's just part of their what they do.
You know, one of the things that's kind of interesting, Erin, is that you don't usually get unanimous decisions. Now, the most recent decision you had at First Liberty was a unanimous decision. This one was. The one about so-called reverse discrimination was unanimous. And that, I think, is a really important signal to a lot of states and a lot of localities when you can get all 9 justices. Sometimes it's 8 in one case. A case the other day, one of the individuals had to recuse themselves. But in many cases, when you get all 9, or in some cases all 8, to all agree, you don't come back later on and say, well, we'll try to challenge that again, right?
Right. That's the strongest message that the Supreme Court can send, is when all of them are in agreement and can affirmatively say from their position on the Supreme Court, say, this is wrong and we're fixing this, or we agree and this is the law. This is exactly what the law says. So, yeah, there's no coming back later and saying, well, I don't know, maybe if we can pull 4 to our side or whatever. Like, no, sorry,
Not a
you're not going
chance.
to win that.
Just before I take a break, and maybe I'll get into the second segment here, you're from Oklahoma. You know this case perhaps better than everybody, but and that's why I wanted to talk to you about this. It ended up being a 4-4 decision because in that particular case, if I remember right, was I think Amy Coney Barrett recused herself, and this had to do with a Catholic school and a charter school, and maybe you can give us the background since you're from the state of Oklahoma and you've been following it only so well.
I have been. I won't presume to say I know the most of anybody about this case, but I've gotten to see it in a lot of different forms from different perspectives. So Oklahoma has a charter school program that the legislature started. The governor signed into law. The Archdiocese of Oklahoma City and Tulsa came together and said, we want to start a virtual Catholic charter school, named it St. Isidore, who is the patron saint of the internet, which I always think is a very fun fact.
I had no idea.
And so, you know, they sign up, they get approved by the charter school board. The Oklahoma Attorney General, Gettner Drummond, decides this is not something that he wants to happen. Interestingly, in the name of religious liberty. So both sides were claiming religious liberty in their arguments before the Supreme Court. But yeah, we ended up with a 4-4 decision, which ultimately it affirms what the Oklahoma Supreme Court said, which is St. Isidore cannot be a charter school in Oklahoma. But the good thing about it being 4-4 was that it only upholds what happened in Oklahoma and doesn't do anything for any other part of the country. And so we expect to see a challenge to. So
one victory after another, and that's the one loss. But even the loss, I think, will come back and change in the future. So lots of winning taking place. When we come back, let's get into the travel ban. That's been controversial. I'd like to talk about that right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Why do young people have short attention spans? That is a question the editors of the Wall Street Journal asked college students to address. Here are some of the best answers. One student at the University of British Columbia observed that we live in a civilization of instant pleasure. Anyone who's used TikTok knows this. Therefore, students are being raised in a culture of instant pleasure and low attention spans. Another student at Harvard University said that he was shocked at the bland content on television that seems to be appealing to the broadest swatch of the population. but the new media focuses on specialized content for different subsets of its consumers. Thus, viewers have options now, and they exercise them in a competitive environment. Another student at Georgia Institute of Technology believes that YouTube and other forms of social media have rewired the brains of young people before the first day of school. He says math, science, and composition will always be less interesting than online content specifically tailored to these children's preferences. He also warned that social media keeps tweens and teens from experiencing the world in a more meaningful way, and it exposes them to shallow connections in an age with increasing anxiety and depression. Another student also points to social media and laments how addicting it can be. She feels that TikTok is the most detrimental thing to happen to our attention spans. It's an endless cycle of bright colors and catchy sounds meant to be consumed faster than our brains can process the content. These students are repeating what I've been saying in these commentaries for some time. Parents need to pay attention to these warnings from students who have seen the impact of social media on their lives. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on the biblical view on wokeness, go to viewpoints.info/wokeness. That's viewpoints.info/wokeness. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Friday weekend edition. If you'd like to join the conversation at any point, 1-800-351-1212. Our second article here is one that I found in the Wall Street Journal. I think it does a very good job in 5 pages of summarizing all this. And let me now try to summarize the summary. And that is, President Trump signed a sweeping travel ban on 12 countries: Afghanistan, Myanmar, Chad, the Republic of the Congo, Equatorial Guinea, Eritrea, Haiti, Iran, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Yemen. And those are individuals which are completely barred from traveling to the United States for the moment. Then you have a number of others, and that's Burundi, Cuba, Laos, Sierra Leone, Togo, Turkmenistan, and Venezuela. In those 7 countries, they may still be eligible for some temporary visas, like an H-1B temporary work visa. Dr. Matthews, this is something we've seen the president do before. Mm-hmm. It was precipitated in large part by a conversation we've had all this week about an individual in Boulder, Colorado, wanting to use a flamethrower and killing Jewish people.
Yes, and the general thinking is there's much more consideration and thought put behind this one than there was when he first came in and did a travel ban. It sort of took everybody by surprise. So this seemed to be much more reasonable. However, there are a couple of issues. I mean, there are still some Afghanistan families that are the family members of people who helped our military. Those military people are here, and they'd like to be able to bring the families, and that may influence. And I saw last night, I believe Haiti is doing going to be in a soccer tournament. I think the World Soccer Tournament is coming soon, and Dallas is going to be hosting some of those games. And as I understand, some of the people Haiti will be playing here in Dallas, and this could prohibit Haitians from coming over to watch the soccer game. So you might get a little collateral damage in this that wasn't necessarily intended, because soccer becomes a really, really big deal.
Yes.
At any rate, so it was probably, we'll see how this pans out, but I suspect the president did a good job in the countries he picked.
Aaron, one of the questions people have is it constitutional? And we do believe that the executive branch has to do some of executive kind of actions, and this seems like something that would be considered constitutional.
Well, I mean, I think we can look at what the Supreme Court said the first time that Trump put in these travel bans and did it, and they ultimately ended up upholding these travel bans and saying, if the executive can explain why and justify it, then it'll be fine. And I think they did do a good job of doing their research and saying, here's our reasons. And I don't think it will be difficult, I think, to challenge this and be successful in challenging it.
Let me come back to what you said, Dr. Matthews, because they have said this is how we came to this decision.
Right.
And that is they justified the restrictions in a number of ways. Several of the countries, for example, have unacceptably high temporary visa overstay rates.
Yes.
In other words, that is one of the problems. You might say, well, the individual that was trying to burn Jewish people to death in Boulder, well, he's from Egypt. That's not on the list. Yes, but that wasn't a country which has had an unacceptably high list of overstays. The other day I saw somebody saying, well, these overstays have nothing to do with the border. No, I don't care if they came here by crossing the border, or they hopped on a ship, or they came here legally and overstayed their visa. It's all the same issue in terms of having people here that are not supposed to be here.
And let me just say that a large percentage of the people who are here in the United States illegally are people who have overstayed their visas.
Right.
Sometimes it's a visa for a few weeks, sometimes it's one for 6 months or so, and they've overstayed those visas, and that has, it's a huge percentage of those who are here illegally.
Again, Marco Rubio, the last time I heard him say it, said 40% of the people here illegally
right.
from overstayed visas. The other part is that also these other countries could not be relied on to issue valid passports which can verify a person's identity. And again, you can begin to look at some of these countries in the Middle East like Yemen and Sudan and Somalia and Libya. These are countries that are just barely hanging on in any way. So to assume that they have the same kind of scrutiny that I had when we were flying through Frankfurt Airport in Athens,
right.
Greece, is just, I think, straining some credulity.
Yeah, corruption is there, and plus, it doesn't include countries like United Kingdom, Germany, France, and so forth. These are countries that have real problems with law and corruption, and so the ability to be able to fake documents and come in is not. It's not a high bar to have to go over.
And I think, Erin, as you just pointed out a minute ago, a lot of people would say, well, is there going to be somebody who'll challenge it? Probably. But the chances of this being challenged are even lower and maybe slim to none compared to what happened even in the first administration.
Right, yeah, and I think something interesting that I noticed about that article was, some of these people are recognizing, well, there are groups, right, that are going to play their empathy card, say this is inconsiderate of the people that are suffering in these other countries. Yes, there are people suffering in other countries that would like to come to America to experience true freedom. But some of the blame goes to these governments that are not vetting their people. They're not. There's a reason they're on this list. So go to your government and let's clean that up, so that you can have a better chance of being able to collaborate or work with the United States or come over and clean up the corruption in your own government. And maybe maybe Trump will revisit his list.
I think so. Let me just mention that this article we posted so that you could find all the facts. One of those is, if you go to the fourth page, after several years of litigation, the Supreme Court upheld the legality of the Trump travel ban, so long as the administration could articulate the rationale for why countries are included. Just talked about that. And then the other one that, of course, you were just mentioning, Dr. Matthews, this was a statement that said, this policy sends a chilling message to those who supported U.S. efforts in the country. That came from the Afghan American Foundation. But while the ban doesn't apply to individuals on special immigrant visas who served in the U.S. Army or played supporting roles, it will make it difficult for Afghans who have the status to reunite with their families in the United States. So I suspect that there probably will be some exceptions to that. And I was just recently talking with an individual that has been corresponding with people in Afghanistan. There are enough people that really want to rise up against the Taliban and fight the Taliban and stay in the country and fight that war, or else if they are not going to be supported by America, and so that's always been the question under Biden, to get them out as quickly as possible because they're still targets, and it's hard to imagine they haven't been caught by now.
And we may see some of these countries reaching out to the administration saying we're implementing procedures to make sure that our visas and our passports and so forth are secure and sound. And so there may be some changes in the near future on that, but I think Trump probably has good reason for doing these.
Well, again, that is our article for you, and I would encourage you to actually take the time to read it through. And if you've found yourself in a conversation, either with a family member or Facebook or Twitter or something like that, let me just mention that's one of the reasons we provide those articles for you. And when we come back from the break, Biden pushes back on the auto pen investigation. I see smiles around the table here. And then, of course, Dr. Merrill Matthews' piece, and that is maybe it's time to have a medical panel oversee the president's annual physicals because, first of all, the argument that was coming from the president's physician would be Dr. Kevin O'Connor is he's fit for duty, he's healthy, he's active, he's robust, he's the
great
best
shape for an 81-year-old.
Best Biden I've ever seen.
4 months before the debate.
Yeah, before that. And then the other one that you talk about in your article, Dr. Matthews, is Joe Biden has a very aggressive form of prostate cancer, and that does not develop within a few months. Mm-hmm. And so there are just some really serious questions that we're going to get into. So I certainly want to mention that, and I'd like to get your comments about that as well. But let me just real quickly, before we go to the break, mention any of these articles we're talking about today. Links to First Liberty, links to the articles by Dr. Merrill Matthews is there. We have our Take Action item. One more time, I thought I would mention that. And Take Action has to do with a piece of legislation called the Families' Rights and Responsibilities Act. It was something that was introduced in the Senate by Senator Tim Scott and Senator James Lankford, one from Oklahoma, one from South Carolina, and also in the House by Representative Virginia Fox. And the argument is that parents should have parental rights. There's a concept. And so this piece of legislation is one where if you wanted to contact your 2 United States senators to encourage them to support it, maybe even sign on as a co-sponsor, we give you information about that. We give you a suggested letter that you can write, which you can modify in any way. It's got about 4 paragraphs, but you can change them around any way you would. And then, of course, if you know what your address is, I'm sure you do, it will then pop up your 2 U.S. senators. You hit send, or some of you would rather hit the button that says print and mail, print it out, put it in the mail to them if you want to do that instead. So all of that is available on our website, pointofview.net. Next week, we're probably going to get into another Take Action item. And I just want you to know that that's up one more time. So if you have been procrastinating during the breaks, good time to send that email off to your 2 U.S. senators. We'll be right back.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places. And some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you, now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please, take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give at 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, love to get your thoughts about this, because this is going to be kind of interesting to get into what was done on behalf of President Biden. What did he know and what didn't he know? Who was signing some of these and how this was all done? Merrill Matthews and Erin Smith in studio with us today. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. For those that are saying, well, it's in the past, forget it. Well, Chairman of the House Oversight Committee, James Comer, is going through the auto pen issue. So one of the articles we've posted here is how President Biden has been pushing back on the auto pen investigation, saying, I made the decisions. Well, you can believe it or not believe it. And then there is another one. The second article after that is one by Dr. Merrill Matthews. No repeat of Biden. A medical panel must oversee president's annual physicals. So we're talking about the auto pen. We're talking about mental acuity. And we're now also going to be talking about the medical diagnosis, which has caused us all to believe that there is quite a cover-up and a conspiracy. And I'll be honest, when I first heard that there was an auto pen, I said, really? I didn't know that you didn't actually physically sign these documents. And then if you have been watching the news, they've been comparing those, and they noticed, for example, that a lot of those particular documents all obviously came from the auto pen because they look like each other. You can superimpose those, even some of the various opportunities where they are giving people a pardon. One of those is very different, and that's the pardon for Hunter Biden. And it is written in a very sloppy way. As one wag said, it almost looks like it's written by a person who did not know how to spell his name, which, I'll leave it at that. So, okay, we know that one probably was handwritten. What about the other pardons that were auto pen? And so there's some really important questions, Dr. Matthews.
Really important questions. And there's two questions here. What Biden is responding to is that he made the decisions. Did you or not? Did you not make the decisions? But then that's one thing. Can you use an auto pen? If somebody uses an auto pen, even if you made the decision, is that somehow or the other binding? And as we were pointing out during the break, employers use that have a lot of employees. They use a stamp on the checks when they do your paycheck and so forth, or just sending out checks. So sometimes that's a stamp. It's not somebody actually signing it.
Right.
That apparently is legal in that case. And then, as I mentioned off air, Thomas Jefferson had what he called a polygraph, and it's one where he is able to write a letter, and there's got a little bar that goes over, and it's got an extra pen working over there, so he's able to copy his letter. He's getting a copy of his letter as he's writing it, and I assume he probably signed it, and that auto pen signed it as well. So is that not a real copy of the letter if he's using one pen but another pen that he's manipulating with a bar is signing it? It raises some interesting questions, and I don't have a good answer for it.
I don't either, but if nothing else, this I think is one good example, Aaron, of sometimes why the younger generation is saying, oh, I really do believe that there's a whole lot of corruption here. I can't even be assured that the president, who's supposed to sign a bill or sign a pardon, we're not even sure he actually signed it.
Yeah, I mean, you think about the advancements in modern technology and the ability to one, clone someone's signature and print that or superimpose that on a document, but also with the dawn of electronic signatures and how do you know if something's valid? You have these certificates that show that it came from your computer or your username, and so there are a lot of questions that I think are going to come up from this and just say, how do we know? How do we know that this is valid? Do we have to take you at your word that you said that, a lot of the things that Biden has been saying recently, we're not sure if he actually knew what was going on at the time, or he may have told someone. Did he know? I don't know. We have had cases, and I remember legislation passed and the president was off in another country and they flew the document directly to there so the president could sign it. So we know that has happened in the past. But we also know that Biden, in some of the revelations that have come out post
election, Speaker Mike Johnson would talk to President Biden about certain things that he signed, and Biden said, "I never signed that."
Yeah, liquefied natural gas.
I think that had to do with natural gas.
Yes.
And he said, "I never signed anything like that." Well, yes, you did, and showed him where he did it. So those kinds of things raise question: did he make that decision, or has he just forgotten? And you could make the case, given his slipping mental capacity, that either one of those is true.
Which, of course, leads us to your piece here that was in the Hill. And it's a very good piece because you are reminding us that there are two issues. The first issue, of course, is the fact that people were saying that he was fit for duty, he was healthy, active, and robust. Those are direct quotes from the physician of Joe Biden, Dr. Kevin O'Connor. And to have said that, in some cases, just months before the most disastrous presidential debate in modern time, is really hard to believe. But the other part of that is, I think all of us, at least the men around the table, would understand that you don't get prostate cancer right away, and something's missing here.
With Biden's physician, the audience needs to understand that he'd been his physician since 2009, I believe. So they had a long-standing relationship. This wasn't just somebody who came in from Johns Hopkins Medical School or something. This had been somebody who's been his physician for a long time. That's typically the case. A president will have a physician. They do the exam, and then the physician will release sometimes portions of the exam. And when the PSA, or the prostate
specific antigen
issue came up, I went back to see if I could find that, because President Trump had a physical in April, and that is online. You can go and look at the PSA score there.
Yes, you can.
So let me go see if Dr. O'Connor did that. And I found NPR covering the issue at the time with a link to it, but the link is dead. They have taken the physical off that. Now, you may be able to find it someplace, but it was not easily obtainable, because I wanted to see if they actually include the PSA. Because the PSA test is just part of the blood test. So typically, especially middle-aged older men, they do the PSA test.
Just natural. Yeah.
They're not having to do anything extra to do that. There's no extra risk. So I would have assumed that they would have done that. Typically with men, prostate cancer tends to be very, very slow growing. That's not the case with Biden's, apparently. But if you're in your 70s or 80s and you get prostate cancer, they oftentimes say, you're going to outlive. You're not going to outlive this cancer. So you're going to die before the cancer becomes a real problem for you. So they don't do anything about it. But I would just be amazed if they didn't do that. And yet you had some people stepping up and saying, well, you don't always do it for men over 70 or 80 or 75 because of that. But this is the President of the United States.
Well, and again, you have the NPR White House web link, in which, again, you have Biden's doctor releasing a rosy medical assessment of the president's mental and physical health only 4 months before his disastrous debate with Trump. And it, I think, raises very significant questions. And Erin, this is, again, why there's such skepticism among Americans, that they say, can we trust anything anymore when we can't even learn the health of the President of the United States?
Right. I mean, and I appreciated your subtle reference to Clairol in your article.
Yes.
I was playing a game at home with my family recently, and it was a game that Jeff Mateer had actually recommended called Mind the Gap. Super fun game, different generations, get trivia questions from the different generational ages. And one of the questions was, this slogan, does she or doesn't she? Only her hairdresser knows. And you had to know who said that. And so the reference to Clairol I especially appreciated, because I would have appreciated knowing that before the trivia game. I might have got that right. But no, I mean, there is a huge question now of, can we, like you pointed out, just have one doctor telling us, what's going on with the president? Can we trust this one person?
And Dr. O'Connor says he ran it by some other specialists who had looked at President Biden and other White House staff physicians, but he doesn't name who they are, and we had no access to them as far as I know. So he says these others have looked at this in my chart and so forth, and they all agree with me. And so it really looks like a whitewash on this, which is why I say even though a president is not required to have the fiscal and release it, I think it would be wise and prudent in these days to have independent people. I suggest, maybe a couple of heads of medical schools, maybe a couple of associations like the Family Practice Association, internists or something. Independent people come in, do this physical, agree on their assessment, and then go and sit down in front of the press and address their thoughts on it. And that way you've got a clear thing and there's no cover-up. Because remember, Democrats always thought that Ronnie Jackson, Trump's first physician, was covering things up for him.
Or even that they were covering up for Ronald Reagan in the latter years and Alzheimer's. After the break, let's talk about that for just a minute, because you got Woodrow Wilson and all the rest. But Ezekiel Emanuel, who is the brother of Rahm Emanuel, who might be the next president, at least he thinks he might be, actually is an oncologist and said, look, he's very clear that certainly Joe Biden had prostate cancer in 2021. And so this isn't something that developed overnight. But let's open up the phones. I'd like to get your thoughts. Has there been a cover-up of the presidency? What should we do? And do you think this investigation in the House is a good idea? 1-800-351-1212. We'll take your calls right after this.
Reuters reports that the Chinese government, which not so long ago forced a one-child-per-family policy on its population, is considering a monthly subsidy to encourage families to have second and third children. Enforcement of the one-child policy was brutal. It included forced abortion and sterilization. A preference for boys led to the practice of sex-selective abortion, and even abandonment of baby girls. Now, China's population is dangerously skewed in favor of men. The policy was meant to keep the population within the bounds of what the country's developing economy could support. According to the Wall Street Journal, the effect has been nearer the opposite. Party leaders finally relaxed the policy to allow families to have 2 and now 3 children. But it's too late. China's aging population will soon begin shrinking, hence the proposed subsidy for additional children. Other countries have tried such subsidies. They never work. Economics and politics writer Joe Toki's article describing China's Great Leap Backward appeared in the Rod Martin Report. Mr. Toki says what was, for many previous decades, China's ultimate advantage, its never-ending supply of working-age laborers, peaked at almost exactly 1 billion people in 2010, according to the Chinese census. By 2020, that working-age cohort had shrunk by more than 30 million. By the end of the century, China is projected to have lost 1/4 to 1/3 of its population. With fewer workers, China's domestic labor costs are rising, higher, according to Joe Toki, than in its Asian neighbors and in Latin America. The draconian one-child-per-family policy may no longer reign in China, but some of its effects are baked in. The fertility rate has dropped well below replacement level, and there are tens of millions of extra men who will never start families. According to Mr. Toki, women in China have indicated lower interest in having children than ever before. Trying to bribe them to have babies won't fix China's colossal mistake. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Erin Smith, Merrill Matthews in studio, talking about your article, Dr. Matthews. I love the fact that, when Donald Trump was in office, they had questions about whether Ronnie Jackson was telling the truth. Mm-hmm. You used the example of when Jon Stewart on The Daily Show talked about Trump being 224 pounds. Everybody starts laughing. Yeah, they probably fudged a little bit on the poundage there. But back to the key issue later on in your article, Dr. Ezekiel Emanuel, who's an oncologist and brother of Rahm Emanuel. A lot of people think Rahm Emanuel may be the person running for the presidency in the Democratic Party. Nevertheless, said he had it while he was president, probably had it at the start of his presidency in 2021. Yes, I don't think there is any disagreement about that. And so when you first have questions about the president's mental acuity, and now you have questions about his cancer, it does suggest that there had to be some kind of cover-up, or at least a willingness to fudge on a lot of the facts.
Right, yes. And the cancer itself probably would not have affected his ability to be able to perform the task of that he has as president, but the mental acuity did. And so it's interesting that you have these things popping up now, and we're, with Barack Obama, you wouldn't have thought much about it because he's still fairly younger. But with an older person in their, late 70s, early 80s, and so, and as you mentioned with Donald Trump, the Democrats kept calling for, we want a psychiatric exam. Remember, there were several people, psychologists or psychiatrists came up and said, we don't think he's fit for office. And
then he took the exam and did better than the exam I took the other day.
But we heard that through him, and I think through his doctor, but even that, we didn't. I mean, I suspect that was probably the case, but I don't think we got the exact findings on it. So just being able to get the exact findings on this, the role of the president in the world economy and defense and so forth is just so important that we need to know as a public, we need to be sure we're getting a valid assessment of what the president's health is. And the only way you're going to be able to do that is with having a team of specialists who are independent and can come in and make their assessments.
The 25th Amendment does not require that you have an annual physical, but I think we should require that. And give us a history lesson for just a minute, because whether you're talking about Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, John F. Kennedy, or Ronald Reagan, we've had some questions that have been raised, and some very legitimate questions raised in the past.
Right, and Woodrow Wilson was, the thinking is that he had a major stroke in the fall of 1919, and that really impaired him, and that his second wife, Edith, may have been essentially being the acting president until the next president came in 1921. So well over a year that he may have been really just not functioning well as president. FDR had polio, and he was having serious other cardio problems coming in at the last part of his life. Just only made it a month or two after his last election. And then John F. Kennedy had pain in his back, had Addison's disease, and he took some strong pain relievers, as I recall. And then Ronald Reagan appeared to be slipping a bit in his last years, and then he released that he had Alzheimer's, about 6 years after he left. Right. And so Democrats were accusing him of slipping mentally at the time, and there was probably some truth in that now.
Yes. And I think one of the things I might point out to Erin, since you're younger around the table, is there was a time in which I feel like the press really did protect presidents. And Franklin Roosevelt's a good example. Never would take a picture of him in a wheelchair. Kennedy the same way. But now, there's so much scrutiny, it is amazing that the people around Joe Biden were able to keep this a protected sphere of protection and a lack of any kind of transparency, simply because the press, because he was a Democrat, maybe weren't that questioning about some of those issues.
Yeah, I mean, who knows what was going on behind the scenes to keep some of this under wraps, and who actually knew what was going on. I mean, we don't know who is keeping secrets from who at this point. I mean, it's all one big question mark, and we all have a lot of questions that we want answers to. Was the president functioning as the president, and was he coherent, or were there people that were pulling the strings? And, those people that may have been pulling the strings obviously had an interest in keeping this a secret, because they were the ones enjoying the power, if that was in fact happening.
Absolutely did. And the even worse part of it is they were apparently supporting him running again.
Yes.
So if they had
that's even more amazing.
That's even more amazing that they were supporting that, because he was just slipping so much. So it's amazing that we were able to do this. And I'm one of those, having been in Washington a lot, who will say Washington's in some ways a very small town. Reporters talk to
everybody knows everybody.
Everybody knows everybody,
Yes.
and lots of information can slip out, and you get this. But this was kept so. Other than the fact that the public was seeing it and saying, "Look, he just doesn't look like he's up to being able to do the job," we really were not getting the stories and the leaks that we normally would expect.
You've got Karine Jean-Pierre. She's going to have a book coming out here.
Independent.
Independent. Now she's left the Democratic Party, she says. And she says, well, these are just cheap fakes and everything, and deep fakes and all sorts of stuff like that.
She shielded for that guy day after day after day. And then you come up and now you're trying to step away from the Democratic Party. You were part of the problem.
Yes. Well, again, I'm not sure how many people are going to buy the book, but when it comes out in October, I guess we need to mention it. But one more time, just before we take a break, we have the House Oversight Committee Chairman, James Comer, who so far has expanded this. Now, earlier in the week, we talked about somebody who said maybe we need a Watergate-style investigation. Doubt that's going to happen. But at the very least, so far, he's asked a number of Biden officials to voluntarily appear for interviews. Well, we'll see how that goes, because the individual that wrote one earlier in the week, which you can go through, he's got the names of all these individuals, and it's like, wow, there are a lot of people that could be investigated, could be deposed, if you will, not that it's a formal deposition, and just to try to find this out, because this can't continue to happen. It's bad enough that sometimes presidents and Supreme Court justices and others would fall asleep during hearings, and we've seen some of that already. It's quite another during this nuclear age where sometimes very significant events take place, and within hours, the President of the United States needs to respond. And if the President is not up to it, we've got a real problem.
And, of course, his aides were shielding him and letting him go get rest and other things because of his age and his mental and physical capacity at the time. But I really think we should address this auto pen issue. Yes. Is an auto pen okay if the president has consented to it? Is it okay? Is it not okay? Does the president really need to physically sign this? I think we need to find out about that.
Well, I think so, too. We need to take a break, though, and if you want to join us, you're welcome to do so. 1-800-351-1212. Going to take a break. When we come back, Miranda Devine talking about migrant crime, and that has really been the legacy of these open borders. Might hold up our booklet that we've done on immigration. Sometimes you say, well, how do I think about this? On the one hand, you have, of course, biblical principles about obeying the law and obeying government. On the other hand, we want to treat those people that are here with respect, and so how to think that through, but we'll be focusing on some of these individuals. And you look at these numbers, it's pretty shocking as to what has happened in this country. And then when you have now the newly appointed Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, ordered the National Counterterrorism Center to try to cross-reference these asylum applications. Are you ready for this? Found already 1,200 illegal aliens with terrorist ties. Sleep well, America. So we'll get into that. Also, Dr. Merrill Matthews has talked about the fact maybe it's time for Congress to grow a backbone and reclaim tariff authority. So we'll talk about the tariffs. American political realignment from William Galston, who actually was in the Clinton administration, but he's basically saying to his fellow Democrats, we're not in good shape here. So we'll get into some of those issues. And, of course, Penna Dexter's piece on China's squandered advantage. So all sorts of things to cover. All that coming up right after this.
Many years ago, they began saying that we live in the information age. Well, today there is so much information coming at us from every direction. The hardest thing is to discern which issues are really important and how can I make a positive impact without wasting my time trying to figure out accurate information. Let me give you a suggestion to help with that. Visit pointofview.net. Look at the tabs across the top. Find the one named Viewpoints. Kerby Anderson and others on our team are constantly watching for news to identify those issues that you really need to know about. They boil things down in a brief summary, and then you can decide if it's something on which you want to learn more and get involved. Again, when you go to pointofview.net, Click on Viewpoints. You'll see exactly what I mean. You'll see the issues that we are covering right now. And when you like what you see, I honestly think you will, you can slide on over, enter your email, and get them automatically sent to your inbox each day. That's it. Take a minute now. Be informed. Pointofview.net. Click on Viewpoints. Point of View will continue after this.
I just wanted to tell you, too, how much I have appreciated Point of View over the years. I've always been taught that we take care of our own, and I feel like Point of View is one of our own because of the Christian worldview that you do promote. And so I have become a partner today, and I just want to thank you so much, and just God bless you for all that you do.
Listen, I wanted to make a quick comment. I'm a relatively new listener to the show, and I really kind of stumbled upon it more than anything because I'm doing some driving now that I wasn't in the past. And my comment really is, I think you guys and gals are more right on about the assessment of this country right now than anything I've heard. You know, I go home and I tell my wife, you've got to hear what they're talking about on the show. It's just so right on. And I tell my parents the same thing.
I'm 25 years old, and I started listening to Point of View about 4 years ago, and it has changed the way that I think and the way that I view the world around me.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Dr. Merrill Matthews and Erin Smith in studio with us. Let's head out to Prescott, Arizona. Steve, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, yes, good day. Yes, I was just thinking on your subject of the auto pen and Mr. Biden's competency. I was just reflecting on how when Mr. Trump was challenged to take a cognitive aptitude test, he complied, passed with flying colors. And did Mr. Biden do the same? I don't think so.
I don't think so either.
This is a party of obfuscation and secretive and not to be trusted, it seems.
Well, and again, one of the things that you're calling for, Dr. Matthews, is a panel so that there's more than, I think, what was it, Ezekiel Emanuel talked about 3, you talked about 5. I'm not going to quibble about 3 or 5, but somebody other than just Kevin O'Connor saying, he's good, we have an individual that's healthy, active, and robust.
Right, and I'm suggesting either heads of medical schools or heads of some of the associations like the families of physicians, ER, internists or something like that. So it's not, you could also pick 3 physicians who are strong Trump supporters or strong Biden supporters, and I'm saying you go to someone who is apart from this and is relevant, is able to make this assessment independently, and that's what we want. And then you have a group of them coming up and making a press statement.
Well, that does, just to play the devil's advocate, raise an interesting question. These heads of medical schools or whoever these people are. I mean, do we know what political side? Everybody's got an opinion. Everybody's got a side. Everybody's getting money from somewhere. Are these people also persuadable to get them to lie if they're promised, some sort of quid pro quo of a sort? It's like, who can we trust? This is my question.
Perfectly fair point. And then that's why I suggested several, and then that they release the findings and then they discuss among themselves, and then they face the press. And so with facing the press, then you have to say, well, my colleague here says this, I disagree, I think maybe it should be this. And so you have that debate going on, and then other physicians can weigh in on it.
Yeah, second opinion, as we talk about so often. Well, let's get into another issue. By the way, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Miranda Devine, she's talking about the fact that we have migrant crime. And a lot of this, of course, came to a head when you're talking about this individual, Boulder, Colorado, who was trying to basically put together a kind of makeshift flamethrower. And as a result, she points out that the National Police blotter is bulging with rapes and murders and robberies and assaults. And Erin, if nothing else, I think we've seen what happens when you have an open border.
Yeah, I mean, I think this issue especially hits close to home in a place like Texas, right? We're right on the border. We're the front lines of where all these people are coming in from. And so I think this is an issue that a lot of people really care about, and it ended up, dictating the results of the election, I would say, largely. But even this guy in Colorado, I couldn't help but, this is tragic, right? That something like this would happen. I mean, not even to mention the fact this guy literally lit himself on fire on accident. So he bad person and also bad at his one task that he tried to accomplish.
And she has a chart in here that shows migrant crime
that
over
was
the
really striking. Yes.
So beginning in around 2020, it starts going up, sort of peaks in sort of 2022, 2023, and then begins to fall down a little bit in 2024. But it's interesting because you've had this long-running debate between supporters of immigrants who say they actually commit fewer crimes than Americans, but you do have this what looks like a significant spike in crime from immigrants in the chart here on the New York Post edition.
And again, that comes from the U.S. Customs and Border Protection. So again, we try to give you some information so that if you find yourself in a discussion or a debate and somebody says, well, I've always heard that actually it is homegrown Americans who have a higher crime rate than migrants, you can see, well, if you look at this, no, not necessarily so. And what's so kind of intriguing about that is it was starting to go up after the, if you will, the possibility that Joe Biden would be inaugurated. And so in some respects, you can see some of that was going up anyway, but I think most of it was up because we had an open border.
And you have this problem. When migrants come in, they oftentimes are not allowed to go to work in most cases. And so how are they going to live? Sometimes they look for family or go to their communities, but oftentimes they're looking to get fake ID so that they can go to work. Right. That's a crime. Sometimes appropriating other people's Social Security numbers, that's a crime. Sometimes it's one of the problems they'd had in New York was prostitution on the street by people who had gone into New York and they couldn't work otherwise. So it just makes a certain amount of sense that crime rates are going to rise, even if it's not violent crime, because you have people here who don't have a lot of money who need to be able to buy food and other things.
And again, you're bringing up a point that goes all the way back a couple of decades when we had Babe Buchanan. Remember Babe Buchanan?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
She was the sister of Pat Buchanan.
And
she was the one pointing out at the time that once you break one law, you almost have to break another law, because if you're here illegally, well, the very first thing you have to do is find some way to fake that you are here legally. So you're talking about a fake Social Security card, a fake driver's license, and it's just like a row of dominoes. Mm-hmm. Once you come here illegally, it isn't just a one-time breaking of the law. It actually sets off a chain, a variety of others as well.
Right. If you're going to set up a house here and begin to work and do other things, you probably have to go through and fake some things in order to be able to do that.
Yes. One last thing I thought I'd just mention in this article, you probably have heard how the particular number of individuals crossing the border has gone down. It actually gives you a link to some of the material that comes from Tom Homan, who is, of course, the border czar, and the Homeland Security Secretary, Kristi Noem, in which they announced in April that migrant crossings were down 99.99%. So something has changed.
Yes, that sounds a little bit high, but it certainly is way, way down. And this goes back to the president's point of we didn't need a new law, we just needed a new president, which is what we sort of said all along.
Of course. Well, again, let's take a break. And when we come back, Dr. Merrill Matthews, we haven't talked about tariffs in a while, so we'll get into that one. Also, American political realignment. Penedexter has a very good piece on China's squandered advantage, all sorts of other great material that we're going to cover here as well. So if you find yourself saying, I'm engaged in a discussion or a back and forth, it could be on Facebook or it could be on X, normally known as Twitter, and you would like some of those facts and figures, that's why we post these articles. And if nothing else, provide some really good documentation. When we come back, though, what are we going to do with these tariffs? And maybe it's time for Congress to exercise some authority. I want to get Erin's comments about that, because if I look at Article 1, Section 8, it sure seems like Congress is supposed to be in charge of some of that, but right now it's primarily President Trump. So we'll take a break, get into some of that, and give you a chance to join the conversation if you'd like. That number is 1-800-351-1212. We'll take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into these discussions, and perhaps you have some comments about tariffs. We'd love to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Why do young people have short attention spans? That is a question the editors of the Wall Street Journal asked college students to address. Here are some of the best answers. One student at the University of British Columbia observed that we live in a civilization of instant pleasure. Anyone who's used TikTok knows this. Therefore, students are being raised in a culture of instant pleasure and low attention spans. Another student at Harvard University said that he was shocked at the bland content on television that seems to be appealing to the broadest swatch of the population. But the new media focuses on specialized content for different subsets of its consumers. Thus, viewers have options now, and they exercise them in a competitive environment. Another student at Georgia Institute of Technology believes that YouTube and other forms of social media have rewired the brains of young people before the first day of school. He says math, science, and composition will always be less interesting than online content specifically tailored to these children's preferences. He also warned that social media keeps tweens and teens from experiencing the world in a more meaningful way, and it exposes them to shallow connections in an age with increasing anxiety and depression. Another student also points to social media and laments how addicting it can be. She feels that TikTok is the most detrimental thing to happen to our attention spans. It's an endless cycle of bright colors and catchy sounds meant to be consumed faster than our brains can process the content. These students are repeating what I've been saying in these commentaries for some time. Parents need to pay attention to these warnings from students who have seen the impact of social media on their lives. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on the biblical view on wokeness, go to viewpoints.info/wokeness. That's viewpoints.info/wokeness. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, one of the other issues that people certainly have a lot of opinions about are tariffs. And certainly one aspect of that, as Dr. Merrill Matthews points out in his article in The Hill, is that, if anything, Congress has that responsibility. And if you would like to look that up, Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, and you're suggesting that Congress grow a backbone and reclaim tariff authority.
Right, yes. That Article 1, Section 8 reads, "The Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States." And a tariff is a duty. It comes under that heading. So Congress has the constitutional authority to do that, and it's not given to the president. Now, what's happened over the years is Congress has said, there may be things that arise, especially after World War I, World War II. We want to be able to let the president step in quickly because sometimes Congress takes a while to make a decision.
Yes.
And so we want to give them certain specific authorities to be able to do something in case there's a national emergency that arises. And over the years that the president has taken those national emergencies, and this is over decades, and expanded them. So I think when they looked at this in the 1970s, there was like 470 national emergencies going on at that one time. And so they passed the National Emergencies Act to sort of end most of these national emergencies. That was in 75, I believe.
76, yeah.
76.
Yeah.
And then in 77, they passed what we call IEPA, which essentially tries to say, the president, you have the authority under certain specified circumstances, if there's a major issue, to do something. But this is not something that's meant to be ongoing. It's not to be standard part of business. It's meant as a national issue arises, you have a certain limited ability to be able to impose a tariff to try to address that. And so what the president is using for all these tariffs is the IEEPA legislation. And that's why when the Court of International Trade stepped up and said, no, you've clearly overstepped your authority given under IEEPA, and we don't believe you have that authority. So we're going to strike down most, not all, some of the tariffs would fit, but most of these tariffs. And then another federal court came up and said, or the Federal Appeals Court, we're staying that decision while we look at this. So I think my sense is the Supreme Court, this will probably go to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court will look at this and fall under what we call the major questions doctrine, which is to say the Supreme Court has said if something is a major piece, if you're taking a major action in the administration, they were primarily talking about agencies at that time, but the president is under the executive branch. If you're doing something that has a major impact out there, you need clear congressional authority, and I think that's probably where it's going to go.
Erin, I know you are a constitutional scholar, but I'd never heard of the International Court of Trade until the other day. It ruled against Donald Trump.
Well, I hadn't heard of the International Court of Trade till I went to law school, and I definitely wouldn't consider myself a constitutional scholar by any means. I do religious liberty, and that's where I've been super focused. So yeah, we don't encounter the International Court of Trade very frequently. But this concept about Congress and the legislative powers and getting to kind of see what do the checks and balances look like now? Right. What do they look like now in the form of our Constitution? Because, in the Federalist Papers, they talk about this exact duty, Article 1, Section 8. They talk about it. I was in Federalist number 32, I was actually reading earlier today because I'm a nerd and I love Federalist Papers. But the reason that they were talking about that was to display the powers that the states had or didn't have. They weren't talking about the president ever, like contemplating that the president would try to take these powers. They always thought that the legislative branch would be the scariest branch and be always drawing in power into this vortex. But what we've been seeing is that the legislative branch has largely been abdicating its duties to the executive branch, and so curious to see how these checks and balances play out in this situation.
And, I make the point of the piece, this isn't about whether or not tariffs are good or bad. You can have that discussion. But this is about the Constitution empowers Congress to impose taxes, and that I think Congress needs to take that back. The Trump administration has said, and President Trump himself has said, if the Supreme Court overrules us on this, we're going to go find another law to be able to justify this. And that sounds an awful lot like Joe Biden. When he was talking about the student loan forgiveness, he said, we want to do this. The Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. You don't have the authority to be able to spend $400 billion. The power of the purse also resides in Congress. And Biden said, well, if you're not going to let us do this, we'll go look for another law to be able to do it under. And my point is, this is not whether about you like tariffs or not. This is about where constitutional authority is. And Congress needs to take back the constitutional authority. If Trump wants to pass his tariffs through Congress, fine. That you've got the approval then. So I think Congress is going to have to step up and do something here. I'm just not sure that this Congress is willing to do it.
Yes. And again, you point that out, that remember how critical Republicans were of President Biden for searching for new legal authority when the Supremes ruled against the student loan forgiveness. And so, again, we try to be fair and recognize that we didn't think it was good when there was an emergency and a particular law that was wrenched out of context to justify something Joe Biden did. And the same kind of thing, I think, here for Donald Trump.
You can't be a constitutionalist only when the other party is in power. You need to be a constitutionalist in both cases, because both cases end up exceeding their authority and doing other things that we need to be able to pull them back to the Constitution.
Well, while we're talking about tariffs, let me take a phone call here. We'll head out to California. Kathy, KNLB, what would you like to add to the conversation today?
Yes, I've been listening to this person that on YouTube, and I don't know that it's factual, but her name is spelled Lei, Real Talk.
Okay.
And she was saying there's some speculation that Xi Jinping may not be in control at this time. And how would that affect? I mean, I was kind of surprised whenever I came across it. I think she is Chinese. She speaks English, and she was saying that he may not be in control, and then she tells why she believes that that's true. And I was wondering if Gordon Chang or any of those, if that popped up on their radar with all this going on with the trade deals.
Sure. Well, let me just mention a little bit later, we are going to talk about China. I'll hold up the latest Outlook magazine, in which, as a matter of fact, the first article there is about China cheating. And then there's one which plays Dr. Merrill Matthews. You appreciate that because you wrote one a while back about the new axis of evil, and you get a mention before we even get into the article. But we'll talk about China in just a minute. But right now, we are dealing with tariffs with China, and this was used as a lever or some kind of attempt to get China to a discussion about the fact that we are many times buying much more from China than we're able to sell in China.
When Gordon Chang speaks, you always want to listen because he knows this very well. I have not seen any evidence that President Xi is not in control right now. Now, there are discussions that because of the economy slipping in China and other financial problems, does the Communist Party at some point, does the military come over and take him out? Same discussions have gone on about Vladimir Putin, but I just don't see any evidence of that right now. As far as I can tell, Xi is in control, and if anybody gives him any problems, you can. There's frequently people who are brought up on corruption charges, and you know there are elements of corruption going on there, but you never know if that's because they're actually corrupt or because they disagree with Xi.
That's right. Might also mention this particular article. It's Liberty McCarter on tariffs. So a lot of what we're talking about is really about China, and since Penna Dexter wrote about China's squandered advantage, we'll get to that. But if nothing else, there are real problems in China right now.
Yes, there are.
We've had Gordon Chang sitting in that chair across from me. We've also had him by phone, and maybe it's time to get him back on and see what he has to say.
Yes, I just don't. Xi has consolidated his power. As far as I can tell, he's mentally stable and in control, and so I just don't see any evidence that that's not the case right now.
Yeah, okay, that's a good point. But it does bring us back to one of the reasons why Donald Trump, long before he even thought about running for the presidency, he's talked about tariffs because he sees this not as maybe something long-term, although then sometimes he sounds like they'll always be long-term, but as a negotiating tool. And after all, he did write a book called The Art of the Deal, right?
And remember, this past week we were supposed to have everybody's best deal.
Yes.
We were supposed to contact him. I haven't heard anything about that. And they were going to do 90 deals in 90 days, remember that? And as far as I know, all we've really got going right now is agreement with the United Kingdom.
Right.
So it's not moving as well as I think he had hoped it would.
Supposedly he's focused on the big, beautiful bill, but even that has hit some roadblocks with Elon Musk. So nevertheless, let's take a break. We come back. I'd like to get into this whole idea of American political realignment. We have written about this before. This one came out years ago on American realignment, and this more recent one on political realignment. But as we get back to this, recognize this was written by William Galston, who was in the Clinton administration, and really, in a sense, writing this to say, does not look good for Democrats in the future for a lot of reasons. We'll talk about that on Point of View right after this.
The Bible tells us not to worry, and yet there is a lot of worrying stuff in our world today. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't stop at telling us not to worry. God gives us a next step. He says we need to pray. But sometimes even knowing what to pray can be difficult, and that is why Point of View has relaunched our Pray for America movement, a series of weekly emails to guide you in prayer for our nation. Each week, you'll receive a brief update about a current issue affecting Americans, along with a written prayer that you can easily share with others. We'll also include a short free resource for you in each email so you can learn more about the issue at hand. Will you commit to pray for America? Go to pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner at the top of the page to subscribe. Again, that's pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in America. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, we're going to spend just a little bit of time talking about political realignment. This article by William Galston is one that appeared in the Wall Street Journal, and it is very readable, but it also kind of looks ahead to what might happen in the future. Now, just a few minutes ago, I held up this booklet called American Realignment. I wrote this back 4 years ago, in which I pointed out that if you look at all sorts of realignment, some of it is geographical. No surprise there. People are moving oftentimes from high-tech states to low-tech or no-tech states. And so the difference between North Dakota and South Dakota, California, Nevada, people moving to Florida, to even places like Texas, even Oregon that has an income tax, Washington that is not. That's a geographical realignment. We talk about the political realignment as well, but one of those is kind of a demographic realignment, what I call the fertility gap. That is, conservatives tend to get married more often, tend to have children more often than liberals, and so they're reproducing themselves at a rate rather dramatically than others. And then there's sort of income realignment and the rest. The more recent one that just came out on political realignment pretty much matches what William Galston is saying. And Dr. Matthews, he's just quoting from the New York Times that says, if you look at the last election, in 3 consecutive presidential elections in 1,433 counties, nearly half of the counties in America, the Republican Party has increased its voter share. And so some of that has to do with the fact that they tend to be picking up individuals who do not have a college degree, which in the past used to be kind of the part and parcel of the Democratic Party. And they're also picking up the Hispanic population, which again was assumed to be something associated with the Democratic Party. So William Galston is essentially writing to his fellow Democrats, we don't figure out how to turn this around, we really will be the minority party in America.
Yes, our listeners have probably heard for years that the demographics favored the Democratic Party because there were more minorities moving into the to the country, and they were going to vote Democratic, and there were more younger people, and they were going to vote Democratic. And a lot of that has changed. As the Latino vote, the Hispanic vote has moved more Republican. Even a portion of the black vote has moved, I wouldn't say significantly, but slightly more Republican, especially among young black men. So it has things have changed significantly over the past. Really, the realignment started with Donald Trump, I think, in his first presidential election, and has just expanded, and it has Democrats worried because they're seeing their voters shifting down into blue cities and especially close urban areas, and that's where they get their votes. But that many of those people are moving out.
Again, Erin, one of the things that you always associated with the Democratic Party were minorities. And even among African Americans, maybe not much of a switch with black women, but with black men tend to be more likely to vote for Donald Trump, Hispanics, and then, of course, the so-called working class. There used to be this kind of mindset, and the two old guys around the table remember when they used to say, well, the Republican Party, that's of the wealthy, and the Democratic Party is for the little guy, and that is almost completely reversed.
Right, and that's kind of, the interesting part about, this article and what people have been talking about recently is, man, people care about the economy, and they care about jobs, and they care about their family and the safety of being able to walk around in America and be free and not worry that you're going to, die by the hands of an illegal immigrant or whoever. And they care about crime rates, and they're tired of being lied to. They're tired of being pandered to by political parties, both right and left. I saw yesterday, among all of the other Elon Musk tweets, back and forth, or whatever they're called on X now. X's, I have no clue.
I don't either.
But of all of the posts that were going back and forth, he actually posted a poll that said, is it time to create a new political party in America that accurately represents the 80% in the middle? This morning or this afternoon, late this afternoon, the results came in. 5.6 million people voted on that poll, and 80% of them said yes. And so if you think about the age demographic that would be representative of those that are voting on X, I mean, it's just interesting to see. I don't know what the future holds for both the Republican and Democrat parties if they can't figure out how to talk to the moderates in the middle.
Where Democrats lost it is the three things they were really strong on. Immigration, they wanted to bring in more and more immigrants. Crime, they simply said they wanted to defund the police. And then you had, of course, the woke stuff. And if whether or not you're sort of just a regular American here in the middle class, and you see the immigrants coming in, and not to be critical of the immigrants, but you had just open borders and a lot of problems going on with that, and Biden not doing anything about it. And then you had the crime that was going on in so many states. And then the woke issues of we got to make sure that transgender and other people get all these benefits, or that men can compete as women. It just turned off large segments of the population, and that trend is, I think, increasing.
I think William Galston would probably say, did you not learn a lesson by watching what happened to the brand called Bud Light, or the institution called Target, or the movie producer called Disney? And in some respects, you could really say that if you wanted to see where the trends were going, long before we had the 2024 election, we already saw some of that unfolding in the corporate world, didn't we?
Yeah, we absolutely saw that the people can vote with their feet and they can vote with their dollars. And people really, they made a large dent, especially conservatives started saying, well, I have just as much power to boycott things as liberals do. So I'm going to start voting with my dollars too. And I think people will forget, and maybe these, politicians or whoever, these talking heads are forgetting that a loud voice is one vote, and so is a silent one. And so everybody's got the same amount of voting power when they go to the ballot box. Just because a group is louder than another doesn't mean that that's exactly the public opinion or prevailing opinion right now.
And that's leading Democrats to an existential crisis as to who are we as Democrats, and what do we want to support. And you've got several different Democrats coming out saying you need to go this direction. But even you have Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, changing his tune. Surprise, surprise, the guy doesn't have any principles, but he has been moving to the right because he may want to run for president.
Yeah.
But it's been interesting. Democrats don't know who they are, how they're going to be able to fight Republicans because of the internal turmoil that they have right now.
Are they going to become the Whig Party or something like that and fade away? Let's get back to this idea. Erin was talking about Elon Musk, a third party. That rings to Ross Perot, maybe. That's what it seems it rings like. It feels like Ross Perot saying, well, I don't really like what George W. Bush is doing. I don't like Bill Clinton, so I'll run a third party. Those just never have worked out very well, have they?
They've not worked out well at all. The only one who really did well in this was Ross Perot in 1992 when he drew 19% of the vote, as I remember. And so Bill Clinton ended up winning that election with only 43% of the public vote, the popular vote.
Part of the problem with creating a third party, as much as we'd like a multi-party system like you have in Italy or Israel, is almost all the state laws are really so tied into a two-party system that whether it was the Constitution Party, the Libertine Party, as well as the environmental parties, Green Party, and all the rest, all of them just have difficulties because they're so much structured around Republican and Democrat. Elon Musk may think it would be great to have a certain kind of independent party, but I wish him well because I don't think it's going to work very well.
It probably is not going to work because the larger parties, the two major parties, end up shifting how they present things.
Right.
And so we'll see if Democrats can do it. But I tell you, Phil Gramm had a piece in the Wall Street Journal here recently saying that presidents who supported tariffs and imposed tariffs ended up losing elections. So you could have a realignment based upon that. You just don't. And Karl Rove has talked about how some of the things that are occurring could end up favoring Democrats if Republicans don't get their act together on some aspects of it.
You know, one other thing in this article, he quotes from the Blue Rose findings, and again, it's obviously a little bit of a left-of-center survey, but they ask individuals what's more important, preserving American institutions, democracy's under attack, or delivering change that improves Americans' lives. 78% wanted the latter. And let's just think about this. Erin's generation and even the generation before are saying, I don't have enough ability to buy a house. I'm not making enough right now. These various kinds of moving jobs overseas have not allowed me to find the kind of job where I can support myself. There are just a lot of serious questions. And if Democrats would get back to some of those kitchen table issues, I suspect they'd do better.
I hear Democrats concerned about the deficit now. Who knew?
Oh, yeah, yes. Who knew? Well, we need to take a break. And when we come back, let me just mention that Penna Dexter's commentary is one that we air right now. So if you're listening online, you can hear it. It's entitled China's Squandered Advantage. But I thought I would tie that into the July issue. You may have not received it, but it's coming very soon, in which we talk about China, we talk about the axis of evil, we talk about tariffs, and we even have a very good piece by Gary Bauer on restoring respect for America. We'll talk about that right after this.
Reuters reports that the Chinese government, which not so long ago forced a one-child-per-family policy on its population, is considering a monthly subsidy to encourage families to have second and third children. Enforcement of the one-child policy was brutal. It included forced abortion and sterilization. A preference for boys led to the practice of sex-selective abortion, and even abandonment of baby girls. Now, China's population is dangerously skewed in favor of men. The policy was meant to keep the population within the bounds of what the country's developing economy could support. According to the Wall Street Journal, the effect has been nearer the opposite. Party leaders finally relaxed the policy to allow families to have 2 and now 3 children. But it's too late. China's aging population will soon begin shrinking, hence the proposed subsidy for additional children. Other countries have tried such subsidies. They never work. Economics and politics writer Joe Toki's article describing China's Great Leap Backward appeared in the Rod Martin Report. Mr. Toki says what was, for many previous decades, China's ultimate advantage, its never-ending supply of working-age laborers, peaked at almost exactly 1 billion people in 2010, according to the Chinese census. By 2020, that working-age cohort had shrunk by more than 30 million. By the end of the century, China is projected to have lost 1/4 to 1/3 of its population. With fewer workers, China's domestic labor costs are rising, higher, according to Joe Toki, than in its Asian neighbors and in Latin America. The draconian one-child-per-family policy may no longer reign in China, but some of its effects are baked in. The fertility rate has dropped well below replacement level, and there are tens of millions of extra men who will never start families. According to Mr. Toki, women in China have indicated lower interest in having children than ever before. Trying to bribe them to have babies won't fix China's colossal mistake. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes in studio with us today, Erin Smith, Merrill Matthews, and Penna Dexter's commentary is entitled China's Squandered Advantage. It really gets into one aspect of the problems facing China, which are significant because she points out that enforcement of the one-child policy was brutal. It included forced abortion and sterilization, and then a preference for boys led to practice of sex selection abortion, even abandonment of baby girls. So first of all, you've got an incredible imbalance between male male and female. Second of all, the population is shrinking. By the end of the century, she says, China is projected to have lost 1/4 to 1/3 of its population. And so if a population is like a triangle, it almost becomes an inverted triangle. That is not good for the future. So again, those are some really important principles when we talk about the issue of China.
Yeah, I mean, no surprise that it's yet another failure by a communist state. I mean, it's of course their policies aren't going to work. I mean, you can't oppress people like this and then expect to flourish. That's not it's not consistent with what we've seen across history. So I'm not shocked that China's one-child policy is failing them. Yeah, you can't pay people to have children. I mean, I don't know. It's not
now,
right.
Think,
That's what they're either contemplating or doing currently to try to get families to have more kids. And it's been so the tragedy of, I mean, killing so many babies and abandoning little girls to the streets or wherever, to orphanages. I mean, I don't know how you can you can't take that back or erase that from people's memories, or it's so deeply ingrained in them that there's a one-child policy. I don't need to have kids. I need to go work or do these things. And now it's all come home to roost for China.
And apart from that, it's the opportunity cost in this, because the Chinese people are so entrepreneurial. They're so creative and inventive that if you had those populations that continue to grow, there's no telling what they could do. They talk about China being the second largest economy. It is right now, but that's because there's so many people there.
Right.
When you break this down to it's about a $12,000 per person in relation to the GDP, is much poorer country than the United States, and much of that could have been addressed had they allowed their population just to grow, and then just think of how much innovation might have been there, and just the population. It's when the government decides to control the population, it's never going to be a good outcome.
And again, the long-term impact is really devastating in terms of demographics, but also psychographics, because my daughter was just on the phone last night with someone she had met who was an Uber driver who was in China, and at the age of 4, her parents just dropped her off at the orphanage. And didn't even explain why. And then over time, the grandmother tried to argue that, well, she might be a good worker. So a couple of years, they come back to the orphanage and pick her up. Well, that's not exactly going to make you feel really close to your parents. And you start thinking about the impact that's having, all these men in China that will never have a wife, and just all the things that are just so disruptive as a result. And so I do want to get to one of the phone calls, but even here we talk about, in this latest issue, of China having its Belt and Road Initiative, trying to get a foothold in other places. Of course, we already talked about the fact that it's part of the axis of evil. We wonder what's going to happen with Taiwan. And again, it certainly isn't as flourishing an economy as we've been led to believe, but it still has a very strong military and is perhaps the greatest danger right now in the world.
Because the one-child policy was government ordained, the government tends to wait way too long. They didn't see their error in the ways until way past time that they should have changed it. And so you've got this problem now of declining demographics.
Let's take another phone call. We'll head out to Arizona. Dave, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
Hello, how are you? Hello?
We're great.
Okay, I wanted to say that, back before we actually got into Social Security, we actually had tariffs in our country, in the United States, and we didn't have debts compiling up and our money continuing to exceed the ceiling debt. And then they got into the part where they put in handing out stimulus checks, putting all this up, and we're paying, and we never had, and the tariffs themselves were, they were it seems to be the biggest issues when they're hitting now is when the time Trump got here.
Let me get into that. I want to give you some history because there was a time in which we funded the government basically with tariffs. But then by the time you get to Woodrow Wilson, 1913, national income tax, and then eventually we have the expansion and Social Security and Medicare and all the things. So whether it's the New Deal or the Great Society, all that, we're spending so much now we can't fund it with tariffs. But there was a time when we didn't even need a national income tax.
That's right, because the government was small, and we funded it with tariffs, but the government was small. So today, the tariffs make up about 2% of government revenue right now. Now, if the tariffs stick that Trump has imposed, they'll be higher, but it doesn't come anywhere near the amount of money that we spend, because we spend about $6 trillion. Our annual revenue is about $2.4 trillion, and we're spending about $6 to $6.5 trillion. So the tariffs, even if they went from about $70 billion a year as they are right now, even if you double, triple, quadruple that, it's going to be not nearly the amount of money that we need to be able to run the government, even a reduced size government.
And that's because we spend so much. And the goal was to have Elon Musk try to pare that down, and I think he brought in savings of, $150 billion, but nothing like the $1 trillion or $2 trillion. And that's the problem. That is the problem. Wish we had more time, but I always like to end with some prayer targets. And Erin, you are on task because you're with First Liberty to give us some prayer targets, because you have some very important cases coming up, and I would encourage people to be praying for those.
Yeah, absolutely. I would appreciate, if those that are out there listening to continue to pray for all of our clients. It's incredible to see their fortitude, their willingness to stand up for what they believe in, and we're so privileged to get to represent them. If you could be praying for Marisol Castro, who's a teacher, she's being punished for having a crucifix hanging behind her desk, among other things. It's very small, lower, so that she could see it. The school district has removed her from her job and placed her in an administrative building. And she is not being allowed to teach her students. And so that is really hard for her to have to deal with. We just sent a demand letter to the city of Waco, Texas, advocating for Open Door Church to be able to participate, to be able to go share the gospel in a public park.
Yes.
To be able to go share the gospel with people in a public park. And so if you could be praying for the Open Door Church and praying for their success and ability to go be in the park, didn't think we'd ever have to be praying for that, but we do. And if you could just pray for Terrence Swain in Ventura, California, mom that prayed before the city council meeting.
That's right.
The city council stopped her. She was the only one that was stopped because of what she was saying and what she was doing. And she was using her public comment time to pray. So if you could be praying for our clients and exercise some boldness of your own. If you feel compelled to exercise your religion, you are free to do so in this country.
Betty Matthews, we always thought we had free speech in this country, and we're finding out some not necessarily. That's why we're grateful for First Liberty Institute. So good ideas.
Yes.
Yeah. Let me just again say, just before we wind down for today, that next week we've got some really good interviews coming up. But and hopefully we'll be able to see our friend Steve Miller, who's been over there in England, who is the producer. But Karen, you've done a very good job, and I know you'll still be working on that on Monday. And of course, we always want to thank Megan for her help engineering the program. If you find yourself saying, you've covered a lot, and I'd like to read some of that, all of it is available at the website, pointofview.net. So take the time maybe to read it, pass it on to others. Enjoy the weekend. We'll see you back here on Monday, right here on Point of View.
It almost seems like we live in a different world from many people in positions of authority. They say men can be women and women men. People are prosecuted differently or not at all, depending on their politics. Criminals are more valued and rewarded than law-abiding citizens. It's so overwhelming, so demoralizing. You feel like giving up. But we can't. We shouldn't. We must not. As Winston Churchill said to Britain in the darkest days of World War II, never give in, never give in, never, 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 never yield to force, never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. And that's what we say to you today. This is not a time to give in, but to step up and join Point of View in providing clarity in the chaos. We can't do it alone, but together, with God's help, we will overcome the darkness. Invest in biblical clarity today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.